started. So good morning. Thanks for joining our expert-led presentation series from the Office of Energy Transformation. This series is meant to help inform our focus area workgroup members or FOG members about various technologies and policies being considered as a way to help decarbonize peak electric demand in Massachusetts. This series is for information only and does not represent the positions of the FOG, the advisory board, or the state. Instead, it's meant to help provide sufficient information to FOG members so we're all working from a similar level of background information as we go into phases 2 and 3 in our Decarbonizing the Peak FOG, where we'll be assessing and recommending alternatives to fossil fuel powered peaker plants. So today's presentation is a continuation of last Tuesday's presentation on the topic of renewable fuels. So we heard from Mike Walsh of Groundwork Data and Steve Panova from EPRI last week, and today we'll hear from Professor Emily Grubert of University of Notre Dame on the same topic of renewable fuels. So Professor Grubert's presentation will be about 20 minutes long with 10 minutes saved for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A feature of Zoom as they come up. All questions or comments entered into the Q&A feature will be visible by all the panelists you see here today, although I will ask the questions to Professor Grubert at the end of her presentation. So with that, I want to get us started, so I'll hand it over to Professor Grubert to present.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for spending part of your mornings with me and for allowing me to be here. I think talking about renewable fuels is always a pretty interesting space as we start thinking about policy, and specifically in the context of peak demand reduction. I think this is maybe more interesting than in some other spaces. So what I was going to do today mostly was talk a little bit about renewable natural gas as one of the primary renewable fuels that people talk about in these contexts. I'll also talk a little bit about how this relates to some of the ethanol, hydrogen, and sustainable aviation fuel contexts as well. But I think as at a high level, people get really interested in renewable natural gas because it's often perceived as a drop-in fuel. And what I mean by that, I realize probably people are pretty familiar with this, but just wanted to give you a couple of the definitions that I'm going to be using. Basically, it's a fuel that can be put directly into infrastructure that was designed to be used with fossil natural gas. So the idea is this actually allows you to avoid having to make a lot of new investments in infrastructure that you might have to with a new kind of fuel like hydrogen or something along those lines. The challenge, I think, as we talk about what that means in a transition context, is that it presumes the continued existence of a lot of that natural gas infrastructure. And so in some cases, that actually can be sort of helpful and probably pretty likely. In other cases, it might not be. So that's kind of an overarching frame. The other overarching frame that I'm going to introduce is basically the conversation around the life cycle emissions of renewable natural gas and how we calculate those. So I do a lot of work on fossil transition. I also do a lot of work on life cycle assessment, actually. And so this is kind of a sweet spot in that regard. But as with the idea that using something like RNG kind of presumes the ongoing existence of natural gas infrastructure, one of the challenges that we see a lot in a lot of different policy spaces is how we define what the emissions profile of RNG is. A lot of the time, what that relies on is a concept known as avoided emissions that I'll talk about a little bit in more detail, which is basically the notion that you should get credit for having fewer emissions than what would have happened otherwise. This in principle makes a lot of sense hypothetically. So if I'm using renewable natural gas and that prevents some other emission from having happened, the argument historically for RNG advocates in particular has been that I should receive the credit for the emissions that didn't happen. One of the challenges with that is that it presumes a baseline of ongoing emissions that may or may not be correct. That gets really complicated, and we talk a lot about that in life cycle assessment practice. I think the other thing, though, from a policy perspective that gets sort of interesting here is that this is basically the only fuel that we really do this with anymore. There was a little period of time when people were making this argument for something like natural gas relative to coal or something along those lines. But basically, when you think about avoided emissions and where that shows up in other parts of the system, you will probably notice immediately that we don't say that like solar power is negative emissions because you have avoided the emissions associated with using fossil power instead. So I'm just going to put that out there before I talk a little bit about how we think about RNG's emissions. So to go back maybe immediately to why are we talking about RNG? Why is this relevant in especially a peak demand shaving situation? One of the big considerations with RNG basically is again that you can use it to displace natural gas directly. So in some cases, we talk about it as a peak shaving opportunity because you can continue to use chemical carrier fuels. So using RNG in place of natural gas directly for something like heating or cooking potentially or electricity generation, that allows you to not depend as much on electricity from other sources. When you start thinking about a fully electrified system, the idea that you could use RNG as sort of a firm source of electricity, so very easy to ramp both up and down because it's a chemical fuel, so you can store it, things like this, that also comes up pretty frequently and is probably a little bit more relevant in the context of electricity stability than peak demand shaving. So in the one camp, you kind of have, let's use RNG to offset some of the heating load. Particularly in cases where you're expecting full electrification, we anticipate that peak electricity demand is going to be driven largely by heating, especially in colder climates. So that's kind of a relevant point. If you can shift some of that into a zero emissions fuel that isn't electricity, that heating demand, that really does alter the profile of what your peak electricity demand is going to look like. On the other hand, if you're talking about using it for electricity specifically, then you are basically using it as a way to do potentially even interseasonal storage, interannual storage, because like fossil fuels, you're actually able to store this methane in large tanks or whatever else it is for long periods of time, and you can kind of spin it up when you want to. This is a similar argument that we see with hydrogen, actually. So having some sort of chemical fuel carrier to take the pressure off of an intermittent or inverter-based resource system at peak times is something that comes up a lot, just because you do have that interseasonal storage or interannual storage that you might not be able to get with batteries or something along those lines. So a couple of not slightly, they're pretty different applications actually for RNG. I will come right out and say it's my opinion that using RNG to sort of substitute for direct fossil fuel use outside of the electricity system, so for things like heat or cooking or something along those lines, is probably not a good use of the fuel. There's not very much of it. And as I'm going to talk about in a second, it's actually not zero emissions probably, and probably also requires the ongoing use of fossil in that situation and sort of a blending situation. So I would generally say I don't think that using RNG as a direct chemical fuel for something like heating or cooking is the right pathway here. The argument is a bit stronger when you think about it as a potential way to take some of the pressure off of the electricity storage system. So having it as what I'm about to kind of argue as a pretty low but not zero emissions fuel, where you're actually using it to generate electricity at times when it's very, very difficult to do that for, years and years of storage with batteries or pumped hydro or something along those lines. Essentially using it as an electricity storage mechanism in gas turbines is probably a better application when we start thinking about taking pressure off of the overall electricity system. It's not quite the same thing as peak shaving, but it has a similar impact when you kind of think about what the system architecture is going to look like. So that's sort of the background of where RNG might be used and how I kind of think about it. Now let's talk about emissions, because I think this is the most interesting piece of this. So probably people know this. Renewable natural gas generally is the term that we apply to methane. So CH4, same chemical composition as natural gas, that is derived from a carbon source that is considered to be climate neutral in some way. This gets a little complicated because historically, when we talk about RNG, it's actually meant in the truly renewable sense, in that it's coming from some sort of biogenic carbon source. So usually from a landfill or a wastewater treatment plant or something along those lines, where the argument is basically that the carbon in that CH4 is coming from a short cycle system. So something that was recently alive and has therefore been part of the active climate cycle for a while, as opposed to fossil carbon that has not been part of the atmospheric exchange. The idea then is basically that when you burn the methane and it turns into CO2 and water, that CO2 is climate neutral because the carbon has recently been in the atmosphere. So there's no net contribution. That's the idea. RNG also sometimes gets used to refer to synthetic methane. That's a little less common, but situations where you're doing something like using direct air capture to take CO2 out of the atmosphere and then upgrading it with hydrogen into methane or something along those lines, where again, there is an argument that that CO2 that is released when you burn it is now climate neutral because of the origin of the carbon. That sometimes also gets called RNG. Varies a little bit. In this case, I think the overall argument that I'm going to make about the emissions profile is pretty similar for the both of them, but I just wanted to make that clarification that you do see it as a little bit of a fuzzy term sometimes. But the point being, RNG generally presumes that the carbon in the methane is going to be considered climate neutral because when you burn it, you're not really adding new carbon to the atmosphere that wasn't already there, within 5 years or something along those lines. This also gets a lot more complicated when you start looking at long cycle biomass like wood or something along those lines. Wastewater treatment plants actually have a reasonable amount of fossil carbon in them associated with the breakdown of fossil carbon based products like shampoos and things like this. But let's put that aside and just assume the CO2 itself is generally considered to be climate neutral. So when you see people advocating for RNG as having a very low emissions profile, the general frame is that this is a zero or negative emissions fuel. There are a couple of reasons for that. So basically, when people argue for it being a negative emissions fuel, we are working on this principle of avoided emissions in two different categories. Both of these are kind of complicated, and I'm going to talk about why I don't actually agree with either of these. So spoiler, I don't think RNG is negative emissions. I don't think RNG is zero emissions. It is probably lower than fossil gas, but probably not actually in the category of a very low emissions fuel. But it gets credited that way all the time, largely as a negative emissions fuel. So, point one of how people get to calling it a negative emissions fuel is basically to say that because you're using RNG instead of fossil gas or something like that, you should get the credit on a life cycle basis for displacing that other resource. And therefore, you have negative emissions because emissions would have been higher but for your use. I think this is the slightly easier one to talk about, why that doesn't make a ton of sense, especially in the policy environment that we're in now, which is basically, first of all, we don't do that for pretty much any other fuel, but most specifically because it presumes a counterfactual that the only other option that you have for generating electricity or doing whatever it is that you're doing is going to be fossil based and therefore generating emissions. If you presume that you're in a world that is climate aware, which you probably are if you're using RNG, because otherwise, why are you using RNG? It's expensive, these kinds of things. You probably can't assume that the only other option that you have is this very high emissions thing. So that piece of it is kind of complicated and isn't as common of an argument anymore, but you do still see it. Some of this differential between using RNG versus using fossil gas, sometimes using RNG versus using coal. Again, we don't really do this with anybody else in policy frameworks. So I think that's probably the easiest reason to claim why that's not a reasonable way to approach RNG emissions. But also, it does, again, presume that you have this emissions intensive pathway forward that probably isn't accurate. The other way that people get to negative emissions profiles for RNG is basically by assuming that you're burning methane that would have otherwise escaped to the atmosphere. So as people I'm sure are pretty familiar, methane itself is a greenhouse gas. So when we talk about RNG or fossil gas, we're basically talking about burning a greenhouse gas and turning it into a less potent greenhouse gas in the form of CO2. So CH4 gets to the atmosphere. That has a much more significant impact on heating than CO2 does. When you burn CH4, it becomes CO2 and H2O, so carbon dioxide and water. And so the argument basically is that you're taking this very, very potent greenhouse gas and turning it into a less potent greenhouse gas. In the case of RNG, the argument specifically is that you're taking methane that would have otherwise made it to the atmosphere. And this applies much more to the biogenic sources than something like a synthetic source, although I'll talk a little bit about why that distinction is not as significant as you might expect in a second. And essentially converting it to something that is climate neutral, because again, we're assuming that the carbon in this source is something that was recently in the atmosphere. So you're taking a potent greenhouse gas and turning it into something climate neutral. The argument then is because otherwise you would have expected the methane to reach the atmosphere, you should get credit for destroying this potent gas. And therefore RNG has negative emissions. This is actually in line with a lot of stuff that we saw out of like the clean development mechanism in the earlier days of the UNFCCC in talking about eliminating high greenhouse gas potency emissions to the atmosphere, largely in the form of industrial chemicals. I will maybe frame where I'm going to go with the RNG with what happened with that, which was basically people started making a whole bunch more of these very high potency greenhouse gases so that they could destroy them and receive the credits for having destroyed them. We know that when you have an incentive to destroy a high global warming potential gas, the incentive structure is not great in terms of what that means for trying to avoid having that gas make it to the atmosphere in the first place. So that's a little bit of the punchline here is basically it's not actually the case that you're destroying methane that would have otherwise made it to the atmosphere when we talk about using RNG. And that's true for a few reasons. So the first reason is basically that in a lot of cases, if you actually do have the ability to capture this methane, you are going to burn it one way or the other. So a lot of biogenic RNG, again, comes from landfills and wastewater treatment plants. It turns out methane as a reasonably good fuel is also explosive. And so you have, in most cases, rules about how much methane you can actually have being emitted from a lot of these facilities at any given point. So if methane reaches like 15% in the atmosphere, it can spontaneously combust. As such, there are a lot of safety rules around making sure that that doesn't happen. And so the methane is usually collected and either used or flared. One way or the other, though, it's getting burned. And so in that situation, if you can catch it, you're either using it or you're flaring it. You're not releasing it to the atmosphere. The other and probably more significant issue actually is that the capturable methane that's associated with these kinds of biogenic processes is actually pretty low volume. So probably looking at somewhere between 1% and 5% of American natural gas use, if you could capture all of the biogenic methane that's being generated, which we generally don't. When you start talking about RNG as a replacement fuel for a lot of other processes on a decarbonization route, what that means generally is that you're probably going to have to make more of it. This is partially why I brought up the point about synthetic natural gas. So something like taking CO2 from the atmosphere and combining it with hydrogen to make methane. It's not exactly the same thing, but we actually do something that's pretty similar from an overall atmospheric perspective when we look at landfills and wastewater treatment plants, in the sense that if there is demand for RNG, I'm a water treatment engineer by training, actually. So this is always kind of an interesting thing to see where this emerges from the kinds of training that we get and where it doesn't. But it's actually very easy to make more methane when you have a lot of organic carbon available to you. Basically, if you're working in a landfill or a wastewater treatment plant, the more that you keep your carbon sources, so all of that biomass out of oxygen, the more methane you make. It's not that hard to tune a facility to make more methane. It is hard to tune a facility to make zero methane, but it's not that hard to tune it to make more methane. If you can get paid for that methane, or if you have some ability to use it, historically, this has been in the context of wastewater treatment plants actually being pretty energy intensive. So they want to make more of their own methane so that they can run their facilities. It's actually quite easy to make more of it. This is relevant because now when you start looking at the argument that burning that methane is displacing methane that would have otherwise made it to the atmosphere, that methane would not have existed but for the incentive to have RNG. So that argument is pretty poor. In addition, at this point, any leakage of that methane that you have intentionally produced has the same atmospheric impact as fossil methane, basically, without that last little bit associated with CO2. But any leakage actually is quite climate intensive. When we start looking at the kinds of scales that people are proposing for using RNG, it sort of demands that some of this is intentionally created. Intentionally created methane is not displacing methane that is otherwise being emitted to the atmosphere that you can't avoid. And if it leaks to the atmosphere, it's creating climate impact. So again, in these cases, you do have the benefit of the CO2 part not necessarily being climate intensive. The methane part probably still is in almost any case that you can consider for RNG. That doesn't mean that there is no purpose for using the small amount of RNG that you're maybe otherwise flaring, but it does mean that this is not a zero greenhouse gas fuel. It's not a negative greenhouse gas fuel. And so a lot of the arguments that rest sort of on assuming that this is very low greenhouse gas, negative greenhouse gas, and then blending it with fossil or something along those lines probably aren't actually real. So let me just wrap this up with a couple of minutes just talking about how this extends to some of the other renewable fuels, and then I'm looking forward to questions. Basically, when you look at other renewable fuels, this notion of their life cycle emissions being determined against avoided emissions is actually pretty prevalent in that space. Again, there's some historical reasons for this. There are also some historical reasons that we don't do this for other fuels. You will never see somebody claiming that solar is negative emissions because it's displacing coal, for example. You used to, you don't really anymore. But with something like ethanol or hydrogen or sustainable aviation fuels, those greenhouse gas emissions profiles oftentimes do include avoided emissions. And being really, really careful about what that is pretty important because it oftentimes kind of implies an expected trajectory for emissions that may or may not be true. Generally speaking, the avoided emissions are sort of evaluated against an assumption that the status quo remains the same, as opposed to being evaluated in a dynamic situation where you expect decarbonization to happen. So my view generally is that we shouldn't use avoided emissions in policy contexts, and it's much easier to sort of just talk about what the actual emissions are and then kind of place things head to head against each other, as opposed to trying to say what you think your baseline would have been. But this is a pretty common issue with renewable fuels, largely because of this question of things like land use change, where the carbon's coming from, these kinds of things. So bigger issue with RNG because of that methane element, but it does show up in a lot of other contexts as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much. That was very informative. And I think we have a few questions that have come in, and we'll probably have more trickle in as well as people type them into the Q&A feature. The first question was asked a bit early. I think some of it was answered, but one part of it in particular, maybe we can specifically speak to. So does RNG have the same emissions when burned as fossil fuels and the same methane emissions at leak point?
Yeah, great question. So same emissions as when burned. Technically, yes, but without climate input, essentially. So you still have CO2, but it's short cycle carbon instead of fossil carbon. So we do actually distinguish between those a bit. That's the big distinction there. The methane emissions at the leak points is a great question, and I meant to actually talk about that. So thank you for the prompt. Yeah, so not necessarily. RNG is actually processed in a very different way than natural gas, fossil natural gas is. And so you may actually have pretty different methane profiles in terms of where it's coming out. Generally speaking, the more times you touch it, the more times you're going to have opportunities for leakage. And so something like a direct use of biogas, which is generally considered to be kind of the uncleaned up biogenic methane along with some biogenic CO2. So out of a wastewater treatment plant or a landfill, we generally think about there being sort of a spectrum of kind of a 60-40 ratio one way or the other with methane or CO2. If you buy combustion turbines that can handle a lot of impurities, like some sulfur and some other things that end up in there sometimes too, you can burn that directly. That generally has lower opportunities for methane leakage than RNG, which is when you take that biogas and upgrade it to the point where it's pipeline quality, which is basically above 99% methane. The reason that I bring this up is basically because the historic profiles that we have of that methane escaping associated with biogas consumption, usually directly at a wastewater treatment plant because they're very energy intensive and have this fuel on hand for themselves to use, is pretty different from what we see with RNG. Because with RNG, you have to do the same thing that you're doing with biogas and then upgrade it, clean it, get it into a pipeline, and now put it into a pipeline network that oftentimes has, once it's in the pipeline network, we would expect it to have the same methane emissions profile as fossil gas in the same pipeline network, because at that point it's kind of indistinguishable. Similarly, on the end use side, once you actually get it into the main fossil gas system, it's going to be pretty similar. But that upstream piece of the production and processing is going to look pretty different. There is some evidence from Europe that biogas upgrading plants can actually have very, very high leakage. Not all of them. And this has been usually in a context where there wasn't as much awareness that that was a problem. So once you try, it's probably a bit lower, but there are certainly instances where the methane emissions from fossil or from RNG are quite a bit higher than from fossil gas. The other thing that gets a little bit interesting here potentially is just that there are more opportunities probably to reduce some of that methane leakage upstream. But ultimately, probably if you want to be really careful about your accounting, what you're trying to beat is a flare. So a really well-maintained flare is maybe 99% efficient. Like 1% of that methane is going to get out regardless. A bad flare is maybe 86% efficient. So you might have as high as 14% losses from that. That's, situations where it's windy and the flare goes out a lot and stuff like that. But the point being, you may actually have higher methane emissions from turning gas into RNG than just burning it in a flare. If you Again, this gets a little complicated because of the idea that there's a use value to using it as a fuel that you don't get from the flare, but that relative it's not necessarily the case that from a climate perspective it's better to use it than just to burn it immediately, because if you just put it into a pipe and burn it, you don't have that many leakage opportunities, so you're really competing with the efficiency of the flare.
Thank you for that. So the next question, it's a bit long, so bear with me, but I'll ask the whole question. Do you think Massachusetts would benefit from an overarching framework that helps universalize life cycle accounting procedures across sectors of the economy and helps the state prioritize the highest value use of limited alternative fuel supplies across multiple sectors?
That's a great question too. And this is, I'm a life cycle assessment person, and I get really nervous about people using life cycle assessment explicitly in policies, to be honest. I teach LCA, and one of the things that I sort of drill into my students is this is a decision support tool. It's not a calculator. And because of that, it's actually really challenging to use it in situations where it has to behave as a calculator with sort of legal ramifications to the numbers. Like having it in a situation where you can use it deliberatively and kind of get people to understand what's going on and make decisions off of that, wonderful. I'm nervous about embedding it into a lot of policy frameworks where you have other ways of reaching the answer. So I absolutely agree that an overarching framework that really talks about resource allocation to the highest and best use is really important. I'm not convinced that LCA is the way to do that, I guess. I think we have enough information about the different kinds of resources that are available to make those decisions without having to get really, really detailed on some of these LCA contexts. That was less true when the whole goal was to get to lower emissions. Now that we're in a zero emissions framework, though, I think it's actually the decision process is much easier in that context because we're not really debating like, well, how much coal should we keep using? It's I think at this point we have a bit of a challenge ahead of us that does require a lot of planning and allocation, but maybe LCA is not quite the right way to do that.
Thank you for that. So our next question is about leakage from making RNG. So the question is, do we track other pollutants that leak in making RNG? They provided sulfur as an example.
Yeah, that's a good question too. Generally, those other pollutants, especially the ones that show up in hazardous contexts or criteria pollutant contexts, are going to be tracked from the facility that's making the RNG on its own. So that's yes, kind of, but not because it's RNG. I actually don't know if that comes up with synthetic gas, but with something where you're taking like captured CO2 from the atmosphere and combining it with hydrogen, which I should emphasize is still pretty theoretical at this point. In those situations, you wouldn't really expect there to be additional pollutants involved. For something like a wastewater treatment plant or a landfill, they should be handling those emissions as part of their air permits in general.
Thank you. We have a question about cost, and I'm not fully familiar with this, so apologies, but hopefully this will make sense. What is the cost premium compared to Henry Hub?
That's a good question. I haven't looked in the last couple of months. I think it's usually like $3, maybe more. So the challenge with RNG too, actually, it can be quite a bit higher than that, not because of the so the price premium is higher than the cost premium. We'll put it that way, I guess, because the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard actually does create a pretty significant market for paper credits associated with RNG as a lower emissions transportation fuel for a lot of also complicated historical reasons that probably aren't super well aligned with how it's being used right now. But because of that, you can sell the environmental attribute associated with RNG at, I want to say maybe I don't know what the numbers are, less than $10, more than three, I think. And so there's kind of a cost premium in addition to this environmental attribute value thing that can make that price premium pretty significant. But kind of depends where you are, but you are generally looking at both a production cost and a LCFS cost.
And so I know we have just a minute left. We might just have time for this one last question, but I'll read the question as it came in. So the carbon intensity of these fuels are typically assessed by policymakers using Argonne National Lab's GREET framework, which has been extensively peer-reviewed and cited. That framework includes the avoided emissions concept that you talked about in your talk today. So just curious if you can comment on how your position is consistent or inconsistent with the Argonne methodology used by states pursuing carbon intensity reduction strategies.
Yeah, I actually chaired an academic review of GREET last year. So yeah, I think there was a time, and GREET has been an incredibly valuable tool in its own context. I don't love the way that it's being integrated into a lot of policy contexts. And I think part of the reason for that is, again, we've actually had a really significant paradigm shift from a situation where we're talking about 10 to 20% reductions in greenhouse gas emissions to a situation where we're aiming at zero. When you're talking about reductions and when the main policy framework that you're thinking about is something like cap and trade, there is an argument that avoided emissions is a reasonable way to approach some of this stuff. Again, though, I really want to emphasize we don't do this in other contexts. Like we do not credit solar and wind with avoided emissions in the same way that we do with biofuels. The way that GREET does this, I don't think is well matched to the current policy environment that we're in when looking at zero emissions.
Thank you. And we do have one other question. Do you have a minute if
Yeah.
we, okay, perfect. So the question is kind of just wanted to confirm the understanding of the lack of displacement. So they understand that capturing combusting landfill RNG doesn't avoid methane emissions, but to the extent that landfill methane is burned in a combustion turbine rather than flared, would that still avoid the CO2 emissions that would otherwise result from flaring?
So, sort of. The CO2 is going to be the same in either case if you have the same combustion efficiency. The differential combustion efficiency is going to be where some of the methane emissions differ. But all that aside, in both cases, we would generally categorize that CO2 as climate neutral either way. Which again,
Thank you.
like to first order is right, to second or third order is wrong. But yeah.
Perfect. Well, we got to all of our questions. I know we're at time, so really appreciate your time, Professor
Yeah.
Gruber, and your presentation today. Very helpful for our FLAG members. So thank
Yeah.
you very
Thank you for
much.
having me. Appreciate it.